Did you know that the screams you hear in House of Wax weren't just acting? Some of them were real reactions to actual danger on set. This movie changed horror forever, not just because of its twisted story about a mad sculptor who turns people into wax statues, but because of how it was made. House of Wax was the first color 3D feature from a major American studio, and it brought audiences to theaters in ways nobody expected. People ducked in their seats. They reached out to touch things that weren't there. They screamed at shadows flying toward their faces. Behind all that movie magic was chaos, danger, and secrets that most fans never discovered. Let's dive in and discover 20 weird and amazing facts about House of Wax. Number 20. The star almost didn't get the role. Vincent Price wasn't the first choice to play Professor Henry Girard, the mad sculptor at the heart of this terrifying tale. The studio wanted a bigger action star, someone who could fight and move with power. But director André de Toth saw something different in Price. He saw a man who could make you feel sorry for a monster. He saw elegance hiding madness. Price had done mostly small roles before this, playing villains nobody remembered. But de Toth believed Price could carry an entire film on his shoulders. The studio fought him. They wanted someone famous, someone safe. De Toth refused to back down. He screened Price's earlier work. He showed them how Price's voice could chill your spine. He proved that terror doesn't need muscles, it needs intelligence. Finally, the studio agreed to take a chance. That choice changed everything. Vincent Price became the king of horror, a legend whose voice alone could frighten generations. And it all started because one director trusted his gut. What seemed like a risky decision became movie history. Number 19. The director couldn't see the 3D. Here's something almost too strange to believe. André de Toth, the man who directed this groundbreaking 3D movie, was blind in one eye. He couldn't see the three-dimensional effect at all. To experience 3D, you need both eyes working together, creating depth perception. De Toth had lost sight in one eye years before. For him, the world was already flat. Yet he directed every scene, every flying object, every moment designed to leap off the screen. How did he do it? He trusted his crew completely. He relied on his cinematographer and technical experts to tell him what worked. He studied the mathematics of 3D, understanding it intellectually even though he couldn't feel it. He watched actors move through space and imagined how audiences would react. Some people thought this was impossible. How could a man direct something he couldn't see? Both proved that directing isn't just about vision. It's about understanding emotion, pacing, and story. He knew what frightened people. He knew how to build suspense. The 3D was just a tool, and he learned to use it like a craftsman uses a hammer. The movie premiered. Audiences jumped and screamed at effects de Toth had never witnessed. Critics called it a masterpiece of 3D filmmaking. And the man who made it all possible experienced it only in his mind. That wasn't just directing, that was pure artistic faith. Number 18. Real disabled actor or clever disguise. Throughout most of the film, Professor Girard moved slowly, his hands hidden in black gloves, his body damaged by fire. We learn his hands were burned and crippled in a museum fire. But here's the twist. Vincent Price had perfectly healthy hands. The production used a double for close-up hand shots, someone whose hands were actually disabled. This created an authenticity that audiences felt without knowing why. People's hands showed real struggle, real limitation. They trembled with genuine difficulty. He studied these movements carefully, learning to mimic the exact way damaged hands would move. He practiced for hours, holding his fingers at painful angles, making simple tasks look impossible. In some scenes, Price wore special gloves with wooden inserts that prevented his fingers from bending naturally. This forced him to adapt his movements, making everything harder. Picking up a sculpture tool became a battle. Opening a door required planning. The result was a performance that felt completely real. But the production went even further. For scenes where Girard's hands are hidden, they built special prosthetics that looked like gloves but were actually twisted, melted wax. Price wore these under his costume, adding bulk and wrongness to his silhouette. Audiences never saw these hidden details clearly, but they sensed something was wrong. That feeling of wrongness made everything more disturbing. The studio never advertised this trick. They wanted people to believe completely. And it worked. Even today, people debate whether Gerard's hands were real or fake. That mystery made the monster more terrifying. Number 16. Phyllis Kirk's underwater terror was real. Phyllis Kirk played Sue Allen, the brave young woman who eventually confronts Gerard in his wax museum. In one terrifying scene, she's trapped and threatened, nearly drowning in a vat. That scene wasn't as safe as it looked. The production built a real tank filled with water, and Kirk had to be submerged repeatedly for different camera angles. The 3D cameras were huge and required multiple takes to get everything right. Kirk couldn't hold her breath as long as the scene needed, so they shot in short bursts. Between takes, she gasped for air, her lungs burning, her hair plastered to her face. The crew worked as fast as they could, but 3D technology in 1953 was slow and clunky. Each setup took time. Kirk grew exhausted. Her costume grew heavy with water, dragging her down. The studio had safety divers nearby, but Kirk later admitted she felt real panic during those takes. She wasn't just acting scared, she was genuinely frightened. You can see it in her eyes, that flash of authentic terror. Director de Toth pushed her hard, wanting real emotion. He knew audiences would sense the difference between fake fear and real danger. Kirk trusted him, but she also resented those brutal takes. Years later, she said that scene gave her nightmares. She'd wake up gasping, feeling water closing over her head. The movie looked thrilling on screen, but it cost her something real. That wasn't just movie magic. That was sacrifice. Number 15. The museum fire almost killed stuntmen early in the film. Professor Gerard's wax museum catches fire, destroying his beautiful creations and scarring him forever. That fire scene was dangerous in ways modern audiences can't imagine. The production built a real set filled with real wax figures, then set it genuinely ablaze. They used controlled fires, but fire is never truly controlled. It breathes and moves and finds fuel you didn't expect. The stuntmen wore protective gear under their costumes, but the heat was overwhelming. Flames roared higher than planned. Smoke filled the soundstage, making it hard to see or breathe. Stuntman's costume caught fire for real, and crew members had to rush in with blankets to smother the flames. He wasn't seriously hurt, but it scared everyone. The cameras kept rolling because 3D required long, continuous takes. You couldn't just stop and start easily. So the stuntmen kept performing while the set burned around them. Wax melted and dripped like rain. Wooden beams cracked and fell. The heat was so intense that some of the 3D camera equipment was damaged. But de Toth wanted reality, not special effects. He wanted audiences to feel the heat and smell the smoke, and they did. People watched that fire scene in theaters. They felt transported. They believed they were watching a real disaster, because in many ways, they were. The stuntmen survived. The footage was spectacular, but it came at a cost. What looked thrilling on screen was genuine danger behind the camera. Number 14. Vincent Price's makeup took hours every day. Professor Jarrod appears normal at first, elegant and refined. But as the story unfolds, we see his scars, his damaged face, the price he paid for surviving the fire. Creating those scars required hours in the makeup chair every single day. Vincent Price arrived at the studio before dawn, sometimes at 4 in the morning. Makeup artist Gordon Bow and his team went to work immediately. They applied layers of special wax and latex to Price's face, building up scar tissue that looked burned and melted. It wasn't a simple mask. Each scar had to be individually crafted, blended into Price's real skin so you couldn't see where the makeup ended. The process was painstaking. Bow used tiny tools, almost like sculpture instruments, to create texture. He painted colors layer by layer, mixing reds and purples and whites to simulate damaged flesh. Price sat perfectly still, barely breathing, while this work happened. Had to withstand hours under hot studio lights. If Price sweated too much, the scars would melt or peel. If he moved his face too quickly, cracks would appear in the wrong places. What looked like simple movie magic was actually endurance and pain. Number 13. The 3D cameras were massive monsters. Modern 3D cameras are sleek and digital, but in 1953, they were mechanical nightmare. The rig used for House of Wax required 2 cameras mounted side by side, mimicking human eyes. Together, the equipment weighed hundreds of pounds. Moving it required multiple crew members and enormous effort. The cameras were loud, grinding and clicking with every frame. Actors couldn't hear each other during takes. So much of the dialogue had to be re-recorded later. The cameras also generated heat, adding to the already sweltering soundstage conditions. Lighting for 3D was even more complicated. Every shadow, every highlight had to be calculated for depth. If the lighting was flat, the 3D effect disappeared. So the crew used twice as many lights as normal, roasting everyone under their glare. The cameras needed constant adjustment. If they went out of alignment even slightly, the 3D would cause headaches instead of wonder. Technical experts checked and rechecked the setup between every take. This slowed production to a crawl. A scene that might take 2 hours in normal filming took 6 or 8 hours in 3D. Actors stood in position, waiting, sweating, while technicians fussed with mysterious machinery. Director de Toth couldn't see the results, so he relied completely on his technical team to tell him what worked. Sometimes they shot a whole scene, only to discover the 3D had failed. Have to do it all again. The cast and crew grew frustrated, exhausted, and desperate, but Warner Brothers had invested enormous money in this technology. Failure wasn't an option. They pushed forward, one painful shot at a time. What looked smooth and thrilling on screen was mechanical torture behind the scenes. Number 12. Charles Bronson's first big break was here. Before he became one of Hollywood's toughest action stars, Charles Bronson was an unknown actor taking any role he could find. He played Igor, Eurod's mute assistant who helps with the terrible work of creating wax figures from real bodies. Bronson had maybe a dozen lines in the entire film, mostly grunts and short responses. But his physical presence was unforgettable. Bronson had worked as a coal miner before becoming an actor, and that hard life showed in every movement. He moved like a man who understood physical labor, who knew how to lift weight and endure pain. De Toth noticed this quality immediately. He told Bronson to think of Igor as a damaged soul, someone trapped in service to a madman. Bronson took that direction and created something genuinely disturbing. His Igor wasn't just creepy. He was sad. You could see a broken human being behind the monster's mask. Bronson brought real emotion to a character that could have been just a horror. This performance caught the attention of other directors and casting agents. After House of Wax, Bronson started getting better roles, bigger parts. He spent years climbing the Hollywood ladder, but he always remembered this movie as his first real chance. Decades later, when Bronson was a major star, interviewers would ask about his early career. He'd smile and mention the wax museum, the hot lights, the strange 3D cameras. He'd talk about watching Vincent Price work, learning how a real actor commands the screen. What started as a small part in a horror movie became the foundation of a legendary career. Sometimes one strange role changes everything. Number 10. The premiere was a wild event. When House of Wax premiered in New York in April of 1953, Warner Brothers threw everything into making it an event people would never forget. They built a giant wax figure of Vincent Price as Professor Gerard and placed it in the theater lobby. People lined up to take pictures with it, unsure if it was real wax or a person standing perfectly still. Some brave souls would poke it gently, then jump back laughing. Inside the theater, ushers dressed as wax museum attendants handed out special polarized glasses needed to see the 3D effect. These weren't the cardboard glasses we know today. They were heavier, with plastic frames and glass lenses. People kept them as souvenirs, collector's items from the dawn of a new movie era. The theater itself was decorated like a Victorian wax museum, with velvet ropes and dim lighting. Warner Brothers hired actors to stand motionless in the lobby, pretending to be wax figures. Then, at random moments, these statues would suddenly move, grabbing someone's shoulder or winking. People screamed and laughed, already primed for scares before the movie even started. When the film began, the audience's reaction was explosive. They ducked when objects flew at the screen. They reached out trying to touch things that weren't there. During the paddleball scene, people in the front rows instinctively put up their hands to block the ball. Can dancers made people cheer like they were at a real show. And during the scary scenes, genuine screams filled the theater. Critics who attended the premiere wrote about the audience as much as the movie itself. They'd never seen people so physically involved in a film. This wasn't just watching a story, this was experiencing a new reality. The premiere proved that movies could still offer something television couldn't match. What started as a horror film became a cultural phenomenon. Number 9. Warner Brothers gambled everything on this movie in the early 1950s. Hollywood was terrified. Television was keeping people home. Theater attendance was dropping. Studios were desperate for something, anything, that would bring audiences back. Warner Brothers decided to bet big on 3D technology. They'd experimented with a jungle adventure film called Wanna Devil in 1952, which made money despite being cheaply made. Now they wanted to create something better, something that would show what 3D could really do. They chose House of Wax as their showcase. The budget was significant for the time, around $1 million. That might not sound like much today, but in 1953, it was a serious investment. Warner Brothers bought expensive 3D camera rigs. They hired top technical experts. They built elaborate sets designed specifically for 3D depth. They cast Vincent Price, who wasn't yet a major star but was respected and talented. Everything about the production was carefully calculated to maximize the 3D experience. But 3D was risky. The technology was new and unpredictable. Many theaters couldn't show 3D films because they didn't have the right equipment. Warner Brothers had to convince theater owners to invest in new projectors and screens. Some theaters refused, which meant the film would have limited release. If House of Wax failed, the studio would lose not just money, but credibility. Competitors would mock them for chasing a gimmick. The pressure on everyone involved was enormous. Director DeToth felt it. Vincent Price felt it. Every crew member knew that careers depended on this strange experiment. The movie finally opened. The studio executives waited nervously for box office reports. The first weekend numbers came in, and they were spectacular. People were lining up around city blocks to see the movie. House of Wax became one of the highest-grossing films of 1953, earning millions. Warner Brothers' gamble paid off magnificently. What could have been a disaster became a triumph. Number 8. Vincent Price changed how he spoke for the role. Vincent Price had one of the most recognizable voices in Hollywood history, smooth and cultured with a theatrical quality that made everything sound important. But for Professor Gerard, Price made subtle changes that most people never consciously noticed. He lowered his pitch slightly, making his voice darker and more wounded. He added a hesitation, a tiny tremor that suggested damage and pain. Gerard wasn't just physically scarred, he was emotionally broken, and Price wanted that brokenness in every word. He also changed his rhythm. Instead of his usual flowing speech, Price made Gerard speak in careful, controlled bursts. Each sentence was precise, as if speaking required great effort. This made Gerard seem both refined and dangerous, like a gentleman who might snap at any moment. Price worked with a voice coach to develop these patterns, practicing until they became natural. He recorded himself and listened back, adjusting tiny details. Too much tremor sounded weak. Too little sounded normal. He searched for the exact balance between elegance and madness. During filming, Price maintained this voice even between takes. He wanted to stay inside Gerard's damaged mind, to never break the spell. Other actors noticed how completely Price transformed. Charles Bronson later said it was like watching a man become possessed. Price wasn't just playing a character, he was channeling something darker. This vocal performance influenced every horror role Price took for the next 40 years. Directors hired him specifically for that voice, that ability to sound cultured and terrifying at the same time. Young actors studied his technique, trying to understand how he made words feel dangerous. And it all started with the choices he made for Professor Gerard. Sounded effortless was actually careful. Number 7. The movie was based on a much older story. House of Wax wasn't an original screenplay. It was actually a remake of a 1933 film called Mystery of the Wax Museum, which itself was based on a play called The Wax Works. The original film starred Lionel Atwill as the mad sculptor and was shot in an early 2-color Technicolor process. It was effective and creepy, but it didn't have the impact Warner Brothers wanted for their 3D showcase. When screenwriter Crane Wilbur adapted the story for 1953, he made significant changes. He updated the setting, expanded the 3D spectacle scenes, and developed Professor Gerard into a more sympathetic character. In the original, the sculptor was purely evil. In House of Wax, he starts as a genuine artist, a man who loves beauty and wants to preserve it. The fire that destroys his museum isn't his fault. His descent into madness is tragic, not just monstrous. This change made the story more powerful. Audiences could understand Gerard even while being terrified of him. They could feel sorry for him even while hoping he'd be stopped. This emotional complexity was what attracted Vincent Price to the role. He didn't want to play a simple villain. He wanted to play a fallen angel, someone who lost everything and became twisted by grief. Director de Toth supported this interpretation completely. He encouraged Price to find the humanity in horror. The result was a movie that worked on multiple levels. It was a thrilling 3D spectacle for audiences who wanted excitement. But it was also a genuine tragedy for viewers who paid attention to character and story. Critics noticed this depth. They praised House of Wax for being more than just a gimmick film. It had real emotion, real artistry. What could have been a cheap remake became something much richer. Number 6. The wax figures were incredibly detailed. The Wax Museum in the film was filled with dozens of figures representing historical characters, from Joan of Arc to John Wilkes Booth. Each figure was created by real artists and sculptors, not just prop makers slapping together quick dummies. Warner Brothers hired professional wax sculptors who normally worked for actual museums. These artists spent months creating figures that would look convincing on camera, especially in 3D, where every detail showed. They sculpted faces with incredible precision, adding individual hairs, tiny wrinkles, realistic glass eyes. They studied historical paintings and photographs to get costumes accurate. Joan of Arc wore armor that was researched and crafted by hand. John Wilkes Booth's costume matched historical records exactly. The sculptors even added subtle imperfections because real wax figures always have tiny flaws. A perfectly smooth figure looks fake, so they added small bubbles, faint seams, areas where the wax appeared slightly melted or discolored. These details made the figures look genuinely old, like they'd been standing in a museum for years. But here's the disturbing part. Some of the figures were designed to look like they were made from real people. When Professor Gerard kills someone and turns them into a wax statue, the production wanted audiences to feel that transformation was possible. So certain figures had a different quality, something in the eyes or expression that suggested a human being trapped inside. The artists achieved this through subtle tricks. They positioned the eyes to follow the camera slightly. They added tension to facial muscles, as if the person was frozen mid-scream. These figures disturbed people on a level they couldn't quite explain. Something was wrong. Something was too real. And that wrongness made the movie's horror work perfectly. What looked like simple props were actually sophisticated psychological weapons. Number 5. The movie almost got banned. In some places. In 1953, movie censorship was strict and powerful. The production code controlled what could and couldn't be shown on American screens. Horror movies faced constant scrutiny. Anything too violent, too sexual, or too disturbing could get a film banned or severely edited. House of Wax walked a dangerous line. The premise involved a madman killing people and coating their bodies in wax to create museum displays. This was dark, twisted material that made censors nervous. Warner Brothers knew they had to be careful. They worked with the censors during production, showing them scripts and footage, negotiating what was acceptable. The killings in the film are suggested more than shown. You see Jared stalking his victims. You see their terror. But you don't see graphic violence or blood. The horror comes from implication and imagination, which made it more powerful anyway. The censors also worried about the film's dark tone. Was it too depressing? Would it corrupt young viewers? Warner Brothers argued that the story had a clear moral message. Madness and murder are punished. Good triumphs over evil. This satisfied most concerns. But some local censorship boards, particularly in religious communities, tried to ban the film anyway. They claimed it promoted violence and occult practices. Theater owners in certain cities refused to show it. Churches organized protests. This controversy actually helped the movie. Forbidden fruit tastes sweeter. When people heard that House of Wax was being banned somewhere, they wanted to see it even more. Lines grew longer. Ticket sales increased. Warner Brothers learned a valuable lesson. A little controversy could be great publicity as long as the film stayed within legal bounds. What censors tried to suppress became a marketing advantage. Number 4. The movie saved Vincent Price's career. Before House of Wax, Vincent Price was a working actor, but not a star. He'd appeared in dozens of films through the 1940s, usually playing sophisticated villains or supporting characters. He was respected, but not famous. By 1953, his career had stalled. He wasn't getting good roles anymore. He worried about money, about his future. Then House of Wax changed everything. The film was a massive hit, and Price's performance was the main reason. Critics who'd ignored him for years suddenly called him brilliant. Audiences who'd never noticed him before now recognized his face and voice everywhere. Fan mail poured into Warner Brothers. People wanted more of Vincent Price, more of that elegant menace he brought to Professor Gerard. Studios started offering him lead roles in horror films. Price became typecast, but he didn't mind. Horror gave him study work and genuine fame. Over the next 4 decades, he appeared in dozens of classic horror films, from House on Haunted Hill to The Mask of the Red Death to Theater of Blood. He became horror royalty, a legend whose very presence guaranteed a certain quality and style. He narrated Michael Jackson's Thriller, introducing his famous voice to a new generation. He appeared on television, in cartoons, in commercials, always with that distinctive personality. Young filmmakers grew up watching his movies and later cast him in their own films as tribute. Directors like Tim Burton revered him. Price's career lasted until his death in 1993, 6 decades of continuous work. And it was all built on the foundation of House of Wax. That one role, that one performance, rescued him from obscurity and made him immortal. What seemed like just another job became his destiny. Number 3. The movie sparked a 3D craze that quickly died. The success of House of Wax triggered a brief but intense 3D boom in Hollywood. Every studio suddenly wanted 3D films. In 1953 and 1954, dozens of 3D movies flooded theaters. There were 3D westerns, 3D monster movies, 3D musicals, even 3D film noir. Studios threw 3D into everything, hoping to recreate Warner Brothers' success. But most of these films were cheap and rushed. They used 3D as a gimmick rather than a storytelling tool. They had scenes where characters threw things at the camera for no reason except to show off the effect. Audiences grew tired of the trick. The glasses were uncomfortable. The 3D often caused headaches and eye strain because the technology wasn't perfected. Many theaters didn't install the equipment properly, so the 3D looked blurry or misaligned. People started choosing regular movies over 3D ones. By 1955, the craze was essentially over. Studios stopped making 3D films. The expensive equipment gathered dust. For decades, 3D was considered a failed experiment, a strange moment in Hollywood history. It wasn't until the 21st century, with digital technology and films like Avatar, that 3D made a real comeback. But even modern 3D owes something to House of Wax. That film proved the concept could work, that audiences would pay for immersive experiences. It showed that 3D needed good stories and careful craftsmanship, not just spectacle. The 1950s 3D boom failed because most studios learned the wrong lesson. They saw House of Wax make money and thought 3D itself was magic. They didn't understand that the magic came from talented people using the technology to enhance a compelling story. What sparked a revolution also revealed its limitations. Number 2. The set was recycled from other movies. Movie studios in the 1950s were masters of recycling. Sets were expensive to build, so they reused them constantly, redressing and repainting to create new locations. The Wax Museum set in House of Wax was partly built from pieces of older sets, including elements from Victorian dramas and period pieces Warner Brothers had made years earlier. The grand staircase came from one film. The ornate doorways came from another. The stone archways were repainted pieces from a medieval adventure. The art department was brilliant at making these salvaged pieces look cohesive and original. They added new details, changed the paint colors, arranged things in fresh ways. Only the crew members who'd worked on the previous films recognized the recycled elements. Audiences had no idea they were looking at the same doorway that appeared in a movie 5 years earlier. This recycling was practical and creative. It saved money that could be spent on the expensive 3D cameras and processing. It also saved time, which was crucial given the slow pace of 3D filming. But it created strange moments on set. Actors would walk through a doorway and remember filming a completely different scene in that exact spot years ago. It was like walking through Hollywood's ghost, layers of stories occupying the same physical space. Some crew members joked that the Wax Museum set was cursed because it was built from the bones of dead movies. Strange accidents kept happening. Lights would fall for no reason. Props would disappear and reappear in wrong places. One night watchman swore he heard footsteps on the grand staircase when the soundstage was empty. Were these just coincidences and tricks of memory? Probably. But the stories added to the movie's eerie atmosphere. What looked like a unique, purpose-built set was actually a clever illusion. Number 1. Vincent Price kept a piece of the set for decades after House of Wax finished filming. Vincent Price asked if he could keep one of the wax figures from the museum set. The studio agreed, and Price chose a small figure of Marie Antoinette. He took it home and displayed it in his study for the rest of his life. This wasn't just a souvenir. For Price, that wax figure represented the moment his career changed, the role that transformed him from a working actor into a horror icon. Visitors to Price's home would see the figure and ask about it, and Price would tell stories about the filming, about the heat and the 3D cameras and the fear and excitement. He'd talk about how director de Toth couldn't see the 3D but somehow made it work anyway. He'd describe the paddleball man and Charles Bronson's intensity and Phyllis Kirk's bravery in the water tank. Those stories kept the movie alive in his memory, kept it fresh and meaningful. As decades passed and Price made countless other films, House of Wax remained special. He'd revisit it in interviews, always with affection and gratitude. He understood that Professor Giraud had given him a gift, a career, and a legacy. The wax figure of Marie Antoinette sat in his study like a small shrine to that gift. When Price died in 1993, the figure passed to his family. His daughter later donated many of his possessions to film museums and collections. The Marie Antoinette figure ended up in a private collection, a tiny piece of movie history with an enormous personal significance. It reminds us that movies aren't just products or entertainment. For the people who make them, they're life-changing experiences, moments that define who they become. Vincent Price kept that figure because it represented transformation, risk, and unexpected success. What started as a job became identity. Bonus fact: the disappeared alternative ending. Most people don't know that House of Wax originally had a different ending. After test screenings, Warner Brothers decided to reshoot the final scenes to create something more dramatic and satisfying. The original ending was darker and more ambiguous. After Professor Gerard falls into the vat of boiling wax, the film simply ended with Sue and her boyfriend walking out of the museum into daylight. There was no confirmation that Gerard was really dead, no sense of complete resolution. Test audiences felt cheated. They wanted closure, wanted to see justice clearly done. So the studio brought back the cast and crew for additional shooting. They added the scene where police officers confirm Gerard's death and Sue is comforted by authorities. They extended the final moments, giving audiences the emotional release they needed. These reshoots cost money and time, but they were worth it. The new ending tested much better. But what happened to the original footage? For years, it was presumed lost or destroyed, a footnote in production records. Then, decades later, a film collector discovered a partial work print of House of Wax in an old studio vault. This print included fragments of the original ending, grainy and damaged but watchable. Film historians studied these fragments carefully, comparing them to the theatrical release. The differences were subtle but significant. The original ending had a more tragic, melancholy tone. It suggested that horror never really ends, that darkness continues even after the monster falls. This was too sophisticated, too unsettling for 1953 audiences who wanted clear heroes and villains, definite endings. The studio made the right choice for commercial success. But that lost ending reveals something important about the filmmakers' original vision. They wanted to make something that lingered, that haunted viewers after they left the theater. They wanted moral complexity, not simple resolution. The theatrical ending worked beautifully, but knowing about that alternative gives us a glimpse into the road not taken, the darker film that almost was. Old choices, hidden consequences. House of Wax is more than a horror movie or a technical achievement. It's a story about transformation, about beauty and madness, about what happens when art becomes obsession. Professor Gerard loved his creations so much that he destroyed himself trying to preserve them. The real artists who made this film understood that same passion. They poured themselves into every frame, every 3D effect, every performance. They endured heat and danger and exhaustion because they believed in what they were creating. They took risks with new technology, with career choices, with artistic vision. Some of those risks were physical. Stuntmen burned, actors nearly drowned, others were professional. Vincent Price bet his future on a role that could have typecast him into obscurity. Director de Toth directed a visual effect he couldn't see, trusting faith and skill over his own eyes. These weren't just people making a product. They were artists creating something that would outlive them. 70 years later, we still watch House of Wax and feel that same thrill, that same fear, that same wonder. We see Vincent Price and remember why movies matter. We watch the 3D effects and appreciate the innovation and craftsmanship. We understand that great films are built on sacrifice and vision, and sometimes a little madness. If you enjoyed these stories from behind the scenes, subscribe for more. Every movie hides secrets, struggles, and moments of unexpected magic. We'll keep uncovering them, one story at a time. Because the real story isn't just what you see on screen. It's what happened in the shadows, in the struggle, in the hearts of people who believed they could create something extraordinary.